Welcome, everyone. My name is Travis Williams, and on behalf of All Rise, I would like to thank you for joining us today for the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court Grant Writing webinar. Um, we would like to thank our partners at the National Treatment Court Resource Center first, and also our funders at the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention for supporting our efforts in hosting this grant writing webinar. This particular webinar is designed to provide information about how to write a successful juvenile treatment court program funding proposal. This webinar will include an overview of the major components of OJJDP's requests for proposals and also examples of each required section. In addition, the presenters will provide tips for strengthening your proposal and identify common mistakes within your program. So I want to thank you guys for joining us. Just a little bit of housekeeping rules before we get started, guys. If you have any questions, please post those questions in the Q&A box below, okay? Don't put those questions in the chat. We want to make sure we have all of those questions in one group so that we can provide you guys with accurate responses at the end of the training, okay? Thank you guys so much for your time. And I'm now going to pass it on to Ms. Erica Law with Just Grants. Erica?
Awesome, Travis. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to share a little information about Just Grants with you guys, as well as the grant preparation, the preparation process to apply for grants. So I'm going to go ahead and move through here. So the purpose of today's session is going to be for us to learn more about the steps that you're going to need to take to apply for funding from the Department of Justice. We want to ensure that you're off to a great start and have the tools needed to complete the process. So what I'm going to do today is take a high-level look at the onboarding process for an entity applying for funding and review additional information. We'll go through application submission at a high level, and then I'm going to leave you guys with some resources for Just Grants, as well as a few other items that will help guide you through the process of applying for funding. All right, so what you're seeing here on the screen now are the DOJ funding offices. The mission of the Department of Justice is to uphold the rule of law and to keep our country safe and protect civil rights. Now, DOJ offers funding opportunities to support law enforcement and public safety activities in states, local, and tribal jurisdictions. And they do that to assist the victims of crime, to provide training and technical assistance, also to conduct research and to implement programs that improve the criminal, civil, and juvenile justice systems. Now, what you're seeing here on the screen are the offices of OJP, the Office of Justice Programs. So the Office of Justice Programs, which is the office that I work under, has 6 other program offices. The first of which is the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and their mission is to provide leadership and services in grant administration and criminal justice policy, to develop and support state law, local and tribal justice strategies to achieve safer communities. And so what you're seeing here on the screen are QR codes. If you scan any of these codes, it'll take you directly to these programs' funding. Next, we have BJS, which is the Bureau of Statistics, and their mission is simply to collect, analyze, publish, and disseminate information on crime, criminal offenders, victims of crime, and the operation of justice systems at all levels of government. Next here, you have NIJ, which is the National Institute of Justice. And their primary, what should I say, their mission is the research, development, and evaluation agency of DOJ. That's pretty much what they do. So what they strive to do is improve knowledge and understanding of crime and justice issues through science. Next here, we have our lovely host panelists today, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. And OJJDP, they provide national leadership, coordination, and resources to prevent and respond to youth delinquency and victimization. Below there, we have our Office for Victims of Crime. and they're committed to enhancing the nation's capacity to assist crime victims and provide leadership in changing overall attitudes, policies, and practices, and to promote justice and healing for victims of crime. And our last office here is SMART. It's the Office of Sex Offender Sentencing, Monitoring, Apprehending, Registering, and Tracking. And their mission is to assist with implementation of Sex Offender Registration and Notification Act and to provide assistance to the criminal justice professionals across the entire spectrum of sex offender management. So these are just the offices of OJP. We like to introduce them, but again, what you're seeing here are the websites for all of their funding opportunities. Now, if you ever go into the DOJ page, we do have a program plan listed, and our program plan is simply a tool to locate potential DOJ funding opportunities. From this page, you can search the site using an opportunity ID. The three links here for Office of Justice Programs, which is OJP, OBW, and COPS. Those links there will take you to those offices and their policies, services, and solicitations. All right. Let's go ahead and jump right into onboarding. So now that we've talked about DOJ, its program offices and the OJP program offices, let's take a quick look at things that you're going to need to do to apply for funding. And we call this the onboarding process. Now, there are three critical systems that are involved in preparing for and submitting an application to the Department of Justice. We've created this roadmap here to kind of show you the high level steps, and it's available for full review in the copy of this presentation, and we'll make sure that you guys get access to it. Now, for entities that are new to Just Grants, the initial onboarding process occurs during application submission, and it relies on two federal systems for critical onboarding data. Now, your organizational entities that are seeking federal funding, they're required to register and maintain an active status in SAM.gov, right? So SAM.gov is going to be your starting point. Now, for this reason, SAM.gov is considered the federal government's source of truth and organizational entity identifiers. So once you register with SAM.gov, they're going to give you a unique entity identifier, or a UEI, all right? That's what the purpose of registering with them. Now, if your entity, your organizational entity, is new to Just Grants, the SAM.gov eBiz point of contact is going to be automatically onboarded as your entity administrator in Just Grants. And your entity administrator is the person that kind of oversees your entity's process in Just Grants. Okay. They administer, they manage the roles, they assign awards to people, but they have a bird's eye view of your entire entity in Just Grants. Okay. Now, once Just Grants receives the, well, let me take a step back. They're going to onboard them as your eBiz point of contact. Now, once onboarded into Just Grants, your SAM.gov eBiz point of contact can transfer that duty if they want to, but they don't have to. Now, for entities that are new to Just Grants, the initial entity onboarding process is triggered when you as an entity submit an application for DOJ funding in grants.gov. And that's where you first apply as part of the two-step grant application process. Now, once Just Grants receives the grants.gov application, the entity administrator is going to receive an email with onboarding instructions. Okay. Now, on the other hand, we have individual entities. And for individual entities, initial onboarding bypasses SAM.gov, and these people will register with typically an EIN or a TIN that they get from the IRS, right? So that's pretty much your onboarding SAM.gov to grants.gov roadmap. Now, we're going to review some of this a little later, but we're going to go through this process really quickly. Now, as mentioned, the initial entity administrator in Just Grants, they're initially automatically assigned to the individual that's listed as your eBiz point of contact in SAM.gov. Now, your entity information, such as the UEI, the legal name, the address, doing business as name, all of that information is stored in SAM.gov, but during the application process, it flows from SAM.gov through grants.gov and it populates your entity's profile in Just Grants. Now, grants.gov is your federal website, and that provides access to funding opportunities for multiple government agencies. So to apply for funding, you're going to need to log into grants.gov using the credentials that are linked to your SAM.gov account. And then you're going to search for funding opportunities and begin that application process. And I'm going to show you that screen in a minute. Do note that it is a wonderful idea to register in advance with grants.gov. It is not something where you have to wait until you know exactly what you want. So you can go ahead and register ahead of time, right? Let's go move on here. And so once Just Grants receives the information from grants.gov from that application, then your entity administrator is going to receive an email with onboarding instructions. And entities that are new to Just Grants should make sure to have an active user as your eBiz point of contact. As you know, no further actions can take place until that role is actually filled. Now, Diamond and Just Grants are the two DOJ systems that enable your entities to manage your users and your work. And your entity administrator is going to use Diamond and Just Grants to manage your users and their roles. Your entity administrator is also going to assign users to awards and applications in the Just Grants system. Okay. Now, once an entity users complete the Diamond registration process, that person can log into Just Grants and complete any assigned work that they have. All right, so that's an overall high level review of going from SAM.gov, ending up in Just Grants. So I do just want to take a moment here to stop and see if we have any questions about that high level overview.
Erica, I think you had maybe 4 questions in the chat, and I think those are going to be answered at the end.
Sure. Okay, I can take a look and do them at the end then. So let's go ahead and move forward. All right, so what you're seeing here is our grant life cycle. All right, so the life of a grant goes there's so much more to it than what you see. So pretty much what you guys are talking about today, you know, planning, preparing grants. It starts with planning. Entities, I mean, the government offices decide what funding they're providing. They write up the solicitations. You know, we go through pre-application, we then go into pre-award. That's where that application submission process goes, right? And you close out pre-award with submitting your application. Now, once you submit an application to any of these DOJ offices, that application goes back to DOJ, whatever program office it is that's providing the funding. They take, you know, a few months to review all of this information and they decide which entities are going to receive funding. And once they decide that, they then notify those people. And that's where the award process begins. That is also where you, as a grantee, would accept your award. And then from there, there are several other processes and things that will happen as you manage your award. After funding, you have monitoring where they come in just to make sure you're managing that money and using it correctly. You'll have to complete financial reports and performance reports. And, you know, sometimes you may need grant award modifications. But then as you progress on to the end of your award, you'll submit some final reports for closeout. So there's a lot more to that grant life cycle than we typically see. So this is just a high level overview. So let's jump into the submission process, right? So application submission overview. So submitting an application, it's a two-step process. It starts in grants.gov and it ends with submission of the application in Just Grants. Most important thing to remember there is that each system has its own deadline. The grants.gov deadline comes first, and typically 2 weeks after is the Just Grants deadline. So you want to make sure that you're meeting these deadlines. The first step in applying for funding really is to locate your funding opportunity in grants.gov. And once you're there, you're going to submit these two government forms, which is the SF-424 and the SF-LLL. Now, aside from those forms, most of the application is going to be entered into the Just Grant system. Now, grants.gov has a deadline. If you haven't submitted the application in grants.gov by the deadline, the solicitation will be removed from grants.gov and you won't be able to apply any longer. And once the application has been submitted and validated in grants.gov, it's then sent to Just Grants for completion. And that can take a few days. Now, like I said, Just Grants also has a deadline, typically a couple of weeks after grants.gov, but you need to make sure that you're clear on these deadlines and meet them. Now, the Just Grants submission deadline allows you additional time to complete your application requirements past the grants.gov deadline. All right. So we say that it's great to submit early to make sure that you're getting everything in. Now, it is okay to enter preliminary information in grants.gov if you haven't fully determined your budget or your project scope. You can edit or update it later in Just Grants, right? Now, all items requested in the solicitation for an application submission have to be in your application when it is submitted from Just Grants. And lastly, here, your applications are customized based on the requirements of the solicitation. So you want to make sure that you're paying close attention to your solicitation requirements as you're completing the application. A great resource that DOJ has provided is a DOJ grant application submission checklist, and you can find this on the Department of Justice grant site. This checklist just kind of gives you an overview of the things that you want to do prior to submitting your application so that you're sure not to miss anything, right? So let me show you what some of this looks like really quickly. As we mentioned, the application process with DOJ, it starts in grants.gov. So this is your grants.gov landing page. If you're submitting an application and you have not registered in grants.gov, you're going to need to do so. So to register, once you get to that page, you'll click the register there in the upper right-hand corner, and you'll follow the steps that are going to be in the lower left-hand corner of the next page. If you need additional guidance on it, there is a video there. There's a link for a video at the bottom of that page that'll kind of walk you through. Now, grants.gov is this login is separate. Okay, it's separate from Just Grants. So grants.gov provides access to your funding opportunities. Now, once you get into grants.gov, you're going to begin by selecting the opportunity that you want to apply for. You'll make sure you're logged in with the email address where you want to receive all of your notifications. And once you've found that funding opportunity that you want to apply for, you're going to receive notifications. Once you start the application process, you'll receive notifications from grants.gov confirming whether or not you've submitted that SF424 and stating whether the SF424 and SFLLL were validated and submitted or if they were rejected with errors. The notification will include an explanation of any errors. So we always say when it comes to grants.gov, we recommend that you submit to grants.gov 48 hours, at least 48 hours prior to the deadline. That way it gives you some time to correct any errors if it was rejected with errors. If you wait till the deadline is submit and it gets rejected with errors and that deadline passes, the solicitation is removed and you will not be able to correct those errors, meaning you won't be able to apply for that funding, right? So great idea to do it a little in advance. Now, just a little note when it comes to the SF424, the name and email address that you enter in Section 8F on that SF424 form in grants.gov, that person will automatically become the first application submitter for this application in Just Grants. So this is the person that Just Grants is going to look for to complete or have listed as the application submitter to complete the remainder of that application. Now, if that is not the person that's going to be doing it, then your entity administrator can also assign up to 2 more application submitters, or they can assign all 3 positions to those that need to do it. But you can have up to 3 application submitters on any application, but they just can't work at the same time. All right. So from there, once you've submitted your application in grants.gov, they have a track my application option. There you can track everything for your status. You can check if your application's been received, if it's been validated, if it's been rejected with errors, retrieved by an agency, and the agency tracking number that was assigned to it. All right. So once you submit it, you'll get to do all of that. So what's next after you do that, right? So understand that a confirmation that your application has been received in grants.gov is going to come. A confirmation of receipt does not mean that it was accepted. You're going to get a second notification to let you know whether or not your application's been accepted or rejected with errors. And again, if it's been rejected with errors, it will let you know what those errors were, and you will have to go to grants.gov and make those corrections prior to the deadline. It is best to submit this application well before the deadline, just in case you need to make additional edits. And once your application has been accepted by grants.gov, then you're going to receive a tracking number that you can use in Just Grants to match your application once it is transferred from grants.gov. Now, Just Grants is the Department of Justice grants management system. All right, so COPS uses it, OJP uses it, as well as OVW. Now, Just Grants is initially used in the application submission process and after being awarded. So it's used to accept and manage your awards. So once grants.gov has transferred the application to Just Grants, there are going to be some steps that your entity administrator must take prior to the application submitter entering data. Once they've done that, and your application submitter will come in and they will complete the rest of the work. Now, as I mentioned before, up to 3 application submitters can be assigned to an application. However, only one of them can work and edit it at a time. Now, the individual that submitted the application in grants.gov is going to automatically be listed as the first application submitter, and the remainder, the other application submitters will have to be assigned by your entity administrator. Now, grants.gov is where you will do the remainder of your application. You're going to submit the remainder of the information to satisfy that solicitation through the Just Grants system. So, some great tips about Just Grants. We recommend that you use Chrome or Microsoft Edge to access Just Grants. Internet Explorer does not provide an optimal experience. For entities that already have a Just Grants account prior to applying in grants.gov, the application submitter should be sure to use the email that's associated with their Just Grants account to apply for funding in grants.gov. If you're applying for or managing awards with multiple UEIs, you have to associate a unique email address with each account. So you can't have multiple UEIs with the same email address. They all have to have separate email addresses. And then last but not least, each time that you log into Just Grants, you're going to need to complete multi-factor authentication, and you'll set this up during your Just Grants registration process. All right. Now, also in Just Grants, there are going to be certain web-based forms that must be submitted directly into Just Grants. The first is going to be your proposal abstract. You're going to have web-based budgets information that needs to be submitted. Many applications are going to also require you to submit goals, objectives, deliverables, and timelines. So you want to be sure that you're getting all that information in. You want to submit budget information. You want to make sure that's included in the budget detail form, and make sure that you certify any MOUs, disclosures, and assurances. So once your application submitters have completed all of these web-based forms and entered all of the information into the application, and they check for errors, then you'll be ready to submit the application. But keep in mind, there is a deadline for Just Grants, so you want to make sure you're doing this in time. Now, just prior to submitting your application, we've now included an option for you to check for errors. All errors in your application must be addressed prior to submitting your application. So once you hit that submit button, Just Grants is going to submit your application. Now, if it gives you a pink banner, then that lets you know that you have errors. All right, so there we are. There's my pink banner. So I've submitted it, and here's my pink banner. Hey, you've got some errors that need to be corrected. So you will have to address these. So I'll have to resolve all of these before I can actually submit the application. The system will not allow you to submit an application with unresolved errors. Okay. So what do I do with them? Whenever you are told that there are errors, there will be information there that will allow you to expand to view the errors that have been outlined in your application. So what you want to do is open the error listing, and you'll use that expand to view caret. The error messages are going to list, they'll report back any validation errors that you're going to need to resolve. And when you open the accordions for any section that's called out in that with a red triangle, when you open those sections, it will show you the specific error location. You want to make sure that you're opening your application to resolve those errors. Then you can check the certification of application confirmation checkbox and click submit again. Once you click submit that time after resolving all of your errors, then your application will be forwarded to DOJ. Now, what happens after you do that? After you submit an application, your entity is going to be notified if they have received an award when all the applications for that solicitation have been reviewed, and that typically happens no later than September 30th of that calendar year. Unsuccessful applicants will be notified no later than December 30th for that calendar year. Do remember who your entity administrator is, as well as the authorized representative, because they're going to be the persons that are going to be notified if the deadline for applications changes. The system is also going to notify the application submitter, entity administrator, and authorized representative when the application has been received in Just Grants from grants.gov. And then the entity administrator will also receive a notification when the award notification has been set. Now, if you've submitted your application in Just Grants, your status for your application will change to submitted. All right. So we've covered a lot of information. Since we're going to go ahead and do the questions at the end, I just want to share with you the awards microsite for the Department of Justice. On this site, you can go here and you can find awards that were previously made. So for those of you that are applying for funding, or you want to see where funding has previously gone, you can go to this awards microsite and you can filter by several different methods. You can search by state and city, or by solicitation number, just to see the entities that are receiving funding and to see more about their program. So great resource for you guys. If you get a chance, take a look at it. We've gone over a lot of information, but I do want to tell you where to go moving forward should you have questions. The Just Grants website has a whole lot of information about Just Grants, including training resources, updates, as well as links to things that you should know, like how to print your application, additional instructions on application submission, user roles, links to the OJP application resource guide, as well as links to funding opportunities, and that checklist that we talked about. Now, DOJ has 3 managing offices that provide funding opportunities. It's OJP, which is the federal agency that provides, federal leadership grants, training, technical assistance, and other resources. So we do have the OJP Grant Application Resource Guide. We'll list information for the funding opportunities, grants.gov support. We have the checklist, the SAM.gov resources, as well as grants.gov. All of this information will be is provided here, but it can also be located on that Just Grants training page. Now, when you go to the Just Grants training page, you're going to see a list of training topics displayed, and you simply select any of those topics to explore the page that's going to open. Now, once you go to any of these topics, what you'll typically find are job aid reference guides. And those are step-by-step instructions with screenshots that'll help walk you through a specific task in Just Grants. We also have quick reference guides, which are shorter 3 to 4 page documents that will do the same thing. In addition to the written materials that we have, we do offer training webinars that further assist you with the various processes that can be completed in Just Grants. Post-award management is offered on the first and third Mondays from 1 to 2:30 p.m. And the key on it there is going to be your grant award administrators, your entity administrators, and your financial managers. We offer sessions for entity management on the second and fourth Tuesdays from 2 to 3 p.m. And that's mainly for your entity administrators. On Wednesdays each week, we hold our application submission sessions, and they're focused on topics for submitting an application, and that goes from 2:30 to 4:30. Then on the second Thursday of each month, we offer a sessional grant award acceptance from 2 to 3. Now, all of these sessions are in Eastern time. They're repeated. They don't cover any new information. So once you've attended one, you don't have to keep attending unless you want to. All right. So that is all I have for you today, guys. I just want to say thank you so much for your time. And I don't know if you want me to, I guess I'll turn it over to Kristen now um, for your portion. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Erica. That was some great information about the submission process and navigating through both grants.gov and Just Grants. To kind of follow up on a couple of things that Erica mentioned in terms of the due dates that we'd like to call your attention to, specifically for the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court solicitation that is currently open and available, that we're thinking that many of you are interested in applying. The grants.gov due date is May 14th. So that's that initial step. And then the Just Grants due date is May 28th. And so that information can be found on the first page of the solicitation that we're going to walk through today. But I just wanted to call your attention to those two important dates that you might be interested in. And we can, again, answer questions at the end of the presentation. So what we're going to talk about are really some of the mechanics associated with actually writing your proposal and submitting the documents. And so this is really designed to be an overview of the project narrative document. We'll talk about a few other related materials that you're going to be putting together, but the primary focus is on that project narrative. And the reason that that is so important is because that is weighted. There are weights associated with each of the categories. So we're going to talk about, before we get into the project narrative itself, we're going to talk to you about a few activities that might be helpful to get you ready for actually the writing of that project narrative. So on the next slide, and again, if you have questions throughout, we would just ask that you put those in the Q&A, and we'll do that. We also know that some of you submitted questions when you registered for the webinar, and so we will compile those and answer those at the end. We appreciate that. So before we get started, there is a disclaimer. We are funded here at the National Treatment Court Resource Center by the Bureau of Justice Assistance. So this is just a disclaimer that the opinions and the information that we'll talk about today don't necessarily represent that of the Department of Justice. And the next slide, if you're not familiar with the National Treatment Court Resource Center, we hope that you will check out the website. But we are designed to be a resource to you as practitioners and researchers, funders, and just folks that are interested in learning more about treatment courts at large. But we do have a section devoted on the webpage to juvenile drug treatment courts. So it's ntcrc.org. And again, we're going to make reference to a couple of specific resources that we think will be helpful to you as you're having conversations about writing a grant, and then also moving forward with your application. There might be some resources on the website that will be helpful. In terms of objectives, so what can you plan to learn, hopefully from this webinar? We think that you will increase your knowledge regarding treatment court grant solicitations, and specifically the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court solicitation that is open from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. The second, that you'll increase your understanding of grant planning activities. So kind of what can you do in order to get ready for the actual writing of the documents? And then finally, how do you prepare that competitive project narrative? So those are the three things that we're going to cover in our time today. So what can you do to sort of get yourself started? And we know from some of the questions that people posed, really wanting to make a competitive case for why OJJDP should issue a funding award to your program. And so one of the things that when we train people on, grant writing, we say really starting from a from a logic model. And some of you may be familiar with what a program logic model is, but we say that's really a 30,000-foot view of your program. And so I'm going to show you an example of that. But creating a logic model, or if you have one, maybe you're working with an evaluator or a research partner, they may have one for your program already. But if not, this can be a really good place to see what is it that our program is supposed to be doing, and where might some gaps be in the services that we're providing to participants. And thus, we can use this grant application as a strategy for addressing those gaps in service, or ways that we can enhance the services that we're providing. The logic model can also be helpful when you're preparing that project timeline that Erica mentioned, that is built into the Just Grants portal. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, but this document can be helpful in you actually creating those goals and objectives. So this is the one model of a logic model. There are many out there. But we think this is pretty straightforward in terms of, how do I read this, and how can it be helpful to facilitating conversations among our juvenile drug treatment court team, and how can we understand what information is generated from this process. So you read a logic model from left to right, and you'll see on the left-hand side are the resources. So you'll think about and sort of write down what service providers are you working with? What are the program settings? So kind of where do these activities take place? Any collaborations, so other entities that you're working with that help you put together this program. What funding sources? What personnel do you have on your team? And so maybe it is that you want to fill a particular position, or you want to add a position to your program. That would be a great place to put this information on that resources page. And then finally, the participants. So who is it that you're serving in your program? What are the eligibility criteria? That kind of thing. The next column to the right is activities. So this is really a list of all of the activities that participants engage in while they're enrolled in your program. So this starts at screening and assessment and goes all the way through. Maybe there's drug and alcohol testing, there's case management, there's treatment, there's education services. So all of those things you would list in that activities column. Then to the right of that are what we call outputs. And so activities and outputs, you kind of think of those together, because the outputs are the quantification of your activities. So how often is a particular activity happening, or how long should it be happening? And in terms of dose, duration, and then over what period of time. So maybe you're screening an assessment, for example, maybe that happens one time and we think that it takes an hour or two. And then we have case management, maybe that happens twice a week for the term of enrollment, or whatever the case may be. So the outputs are the quantification of the activities. Then you can look to the next right column, which is outcomes. And these are the change statements. So what change do you think will occur in the lives of your participants as a result of those program activities that you just talked about? So maybe you want to, increase recovery capital. Maybe you want to decrease substance use. You want to increase educational attainment. So all of those things would be listed here. Again, the specific change that you want to see. And really, all of the activities should be tied to at least one outcome, because that demonstrates the purpose really of that activity. And then finally, all the way on the right are the goals. And so think of these as big picture, kind of at the end of the day, taking all of those outcomes into consideration. What do you think may result from your program? So these can be short-term goals, intermediate, or long-term goals. But again, these are big picture, pie in the sky. What do we think is going to happen as a result? So we encourage programs to really kind of put down this information and have conversations about maybe you have an existing program and you want to enhance that that project. Maybe you're applying for category 2, the expansion and enhancement. Really identifying maybe a place where you would like to increase the number of something. So you want to increase those outputs. What is it that you want to do? What do you need in order to make that happen? If you say, we don't have a program, we're applying for category 1, we're going to be planning and implementing a program, it would be helpful to have this information as well. What do you plan to implement to make sure that you're hitting all of those areas and you're addressing the full scope of need for your participants? So this can be useful in many different ways, certainly in the process of grant writing, but also facilitating those conversations among team members. So that would be a place we would, recommend that you start. But in addition to that, we would also recommend that you review your program data. So if you have, a data collection strategy, for those of you that have existing programs, look at your data and see if there are places where you want to bolster services, or maybe have conversations with your treatment providers and your recovery support service providers about what else could we be doing to address the needs of participants. So look at that program data if you have it. Also, if you're working with an evaluator or a research partner, have conversations with that individual or those individuals about, what are they seeing in those evaluation reports? What recommendations would they have? Also looking at the literature to see, what are best practices and that sort of thing for this target population. So looking at that logic model, looking at the data, having those conversations with team members about what it is that you want to do. Those are good places to start before you begin writing, because you want to have an idea of what is it that we're going to be doing and what do we need. And then as you're having those conversations, the next step is really to identify, okay, what is it that we need? Do we need personnel? Do we need to purchase a particular curriculum and training for our staff to implement that curriculum? Do we need contracts with outside partners? Do we need operational materials? So really, we encourage folks to, kind of make a list in an Excel or a Word file where you can document specifically what is it that you're going to need in order to make these enhancements, or if you're designing a program, what is it that you're going to need to get started? And then also make a list of the cost associated with that. So if it's personnel, you need a particular salary and you need benefits. What does that look like? That will help you then build out your budget, which is another component that Erica mentioned. You're going to be entering that budget right into Just Grants. So having, a Word file or an Excel file to kind of walk that through and make sure that you're not going over the maximum amount that's allowed for a particular category. And so for category 1, for those of you that are looking to design and implement a juvenile drug treatment court, the maximum amount is $1 million. If you're category 2, so if you have an existing juvenile drug treatment court program and you want to expand or enhance that program, the maximum is $650,000. And those are over 48 months. And so that information is located at the beginning of the solicitation there on page 3. So we would encourage that you look at that information and kind of see what is it that you need and does that fall in line with the maximum amount. You don't have to ask for the maximum, but you certainly don't want to go over that maximum. So on the next slide, we have 2 pieces here that we want to sort of walk through, and we'll make these available as handouts. This is kind of an overview of the guidelines and objectives related to juvenile drug treatment courts. So if you're designing and implementing a program, you want to make sure in your application that you're talking about how you're addressing all 7 objectives and guidelines. You want to make sure in designing your program around these guidelines. For those of you that are enhancing or expanding a program, you want to align what it is that you need and what the places where you're building out your program. You want to align that with what guideline does that address? And you want to highlight that again in the body of your project narrative. We'll talk more about that. But this particular handout can be really helpful for aligning that so that when you go to write, you have kind of an overview of what is it that you need to highlight there. So familiarize yourself with that. We have that document. If you want to read more, if you haven't looked at that in a moment, you can see specifically what is related to all 7 guidelines there. If you're expanding or enhancing a program, you can also look here about, what are the specific enhancement activities? So again, maybe you want to implement a particular curriculum with participants. What guideline does that address? So maybe that's guideline 3. And what's current practice? Because you're going to want to talk about currently this is happening, but we want to do this. And so by implementing this enhancement activity, we're going to get to a better place, and we're going to address need and hopefully improve outcomes. So that's what you would write in the what will change as a result of that. And then if there are any costs, again, this is just designed to be an overview of what does that enhancement look like. So these 2 documents we hope are helpful for really just organizing your thoughts and making sure that you're addressing the really important pieces within the body of that project narrative. So again, we'll make these available so that you can actually write on them and utilize them. So a couple of other things before you get started. So again, all of that, we would recommend that you complete all of that or walk through those exercises before you begin writing, because that will put you in a much better place for what is it that I need to write, having all of that information. So ensuring that you've carefully read the solicitation. And so again, this is the solicitation. It's, I believe, 30 pages of information, but carefully reading that solicitation. Christy and I write a lot of grants, and so we say, at minimum, read the thing 3 times over. The first is kind of all at once, and then the second and third time, go back and highlight or underline, make little notes to yourself about, we need to make sure we talk about this. We need to make sure we talk about that. So really familiarizing yourself with the requirements and also what is it that OJJDP is looking for with this solicitation. And again, we're going to talk about some of this as it relates to the specific components of that project narrative. You also need to keep in mind about who can the applicant be. And so this information for this solicitation is on page 3, right below the chart that lists the time period, so the 48 months, and also the category 1 and category 2 dollar amounts. So who can apply? State government, city or township government, county governments, Native American tribal governments, and Native American tribal organizations. So ensuring that whoever you're representing, that they represent that particular organization, or I should say organization type. Again, I mentioned the due dates. So just reiterating that May 14th is the just grant or the grants.gov deadline. And then May 28th is the just grants deadline. And so those are important. And then finally, what will the grant funds support? So within the body of the solicitation, it will talk about, what are allowable costs and what are unallowable costs. So making sure that you are clear on that, and in the budget and in your budget narrative, that you don't have anything in there that is not allowable. So just giving the reviewer nothing to subtract scoring points from your application. And then this is just kind of a reiteration of what I've already said in terms of determining the issue or the need to be addressed with funding. So within the body of the solicitation, it talks about what OJJDP hopes to do with this portfolio of funding. And we would suggest that you align your project design, if you're starting a program or if you're enhancing a program, that you align your project with OJJDP's kind of mission and their goals for this portfolio of funding. Will you need any community partners? So again, this is where those worksheets can be really helpful. If you, maybe you can't carry this out, so you need a community partner to actually, facilitate something. Have a conversation with that community partner, and you might need a memorandum of understanding or a memorandum of agreement. Maybe you need a letter of support. So again, figuring out what it is that you need and starting that process early. Memorandums of understanding and letters of support take time. People have to draft them. And depending on that organization's policies and procedures, it may have to go through a series of review and signature. So just making sure that you have time and getting those letters of support signed and back before that deadline. So again, keeping that in mind. And then also any evidence-based practices that you're going to utilize. So making sure that you're implementing evidence-based practices, that's really important as well. And then thinking about what program elements will be supported. So again, going back to the JDTC guidelines and aligning what it is that you're proposing with those guidelines. So now that you've done all of that, you're going to create an outline of the solicitation. So again, you've read the solicitation a couple of times, you've underlined, you've highlighted. We recommend, and we do this routinely, is creating an outline of the solicitation. So what is it that we need for that statement of the issue? What do we need for project design and implementation? What do we need for capabilities and competencies? What do we need for the performance measures? So a list of each of the subheadings within your project narrative, and also the bullet points or the questions that you need to answer within each one of those sections. That's really helpful. And we'll talk more about that. We'll give you some examples of what that looks like. Also paying attention to the dollar amount and the length of the grant period. So again, as I mentioned earlier, this is 48 months for both category 1 and 2. And then depending on which category you're applying for, there is a different maximum dollar amount. You don't have to ask for the maximum, but you certainly don't want to go over. And then the next step is really important, and this can be helpful to facilitating this grant writing process. Creating a to-do list of, okay, what are all of the documents that we need for submission, certainly keeping in mind the deadlines, and then from whom do we need documentation? So maybe you need those letters of support or the memorandum of understanding. Maybe you need resumes and job descriptions. So what do you need from other people? What do you need to develop internally, maybe on your program or your team? Then assigning tasks to individuals or entities with deadlines. So again, when Christy and I do this, we assign different folks tasks, and then they're responsible for getting those documents completed and back into a shared folder, where we keep all of those grant writing materials. So assigning those, figuring out who on your team can help you with this process. This is certainly a job bigger than one person. So solicit the help of individuals that can be helpful on that team. And then also designate at one person to organize all of that information. So kind of keeping track of what documents have been completed, what documents are still outstanding, what has been uploaded. So really the key here is having a list, designating roles and responsibilities, but then also keeping organized. What do you have that's completed? What is still outstanding? And just sharing that information with the team of folks that are working on this grant application as you move through the process and closer to the due date. So now we're going to move to the interesting part. So all of that is really what we consider planning activities. You're getting ready to write. And now, what are some strategies for writing the document? So the project narrative, and we're going to walk through each of these sections, but it's important to keep in mind, number one, there are some required formatting issues that you need to consider. So we recommend that folks write this in, say, a Word file with the formatting already in place. And that you write, and then you're going to upload these documents to JustGrants as PDF files. So that's kind of an easy way to think of it, but always have a Word document backup, if you will. So this is going to be double spaced. So this is a 30-page maximum for the project narrative. Cannot go over 30 pages. Double spaced, 12-point font with 1-inch margins. So that is what it has to be in order for it to go to review. All right. Then within the project narrative, there are 4 main headings, and the information is outlined in the solicitation. We're going to talk about it. But what I want you to note here are the weights associated with each of these sections. So the description of the issue, which is section A, the reviewers are going to weight that section at 10% of the score. Project design and implementation, that's section B, that is 45% of the score. Section C, capabilities and competencies, that's 25% of the score. Then part D, which is plan for collecting data required for the solicitation's performance measures, that is 10%. So if you're doing the math in your head, you'll see that that is 90%. The other 10% is given to the budget. So the budget and the budget detail worksheet and the budget justification, that document is weighted at 10%. Okay. So all 4 of these sections, A through D, are in that 30-page maximum that they're going to read. Okay. And one of the things that we like to tell folks as you begin the writing process, and really keeping this in mind throughout the writing process, is think of this as though you're telling a story. So you're starting off with a description of the issue. You're telling the reader who is going to be scoring this and making a funding recommendation, here's the issue that we're having in our community with our drug treatment court program participant population. These are the unmet needs. This is what we're trying to do. Part B, project design and implementation. Okay, this is what we're going to do in order to address that need that we just talked about in part A. Section C, capabilities and competencies. This is why our program is well positioned and our jurisdiction is well positioned to manage this grant fiscally and administratively and also programmatically. And then part D, this is how we're going to collect the information that is required for this particular solicitation. But also, we're going to be able to tell you about how effective this intervention and the project design and implementation activities are on the target population. So think of this throughout as though you're telling a story, and you want to leave the reviewer with no question about what it is that you're doing, why you're doing it, and that this can actually be something that's carried out during the project performance period. Okay, so we tell folks just write, answer the bullet points, which we're going to look at in just a second, within each of these sections, but really write, and then you can go back and revise, have another pair of eyes or another person on your team read it and see if that makes sense, if there's anything that may not seem quite right, or move this sentence up. All of that information is important and is part of this process, but think of it as telling a story throughout. So description of the issue, part A. Again, as I mentioned, this is the first section outside of the abstract, which we'll talk about in a moment. But this is the first really content-heavy section that a reviewer is going to read. And so it's important that this section is clear, concise, and convincing. You're going to state the need or the issue that you're trying to address, any challenges that you've experienced within your jurisdiction or in your program. And then also the benefits to be realized. Like, okay, so you implement this, what is that going to produce? And again, that's where those planning documents can be really helpful to kind of writing that and crafting that clear, convincing, and concise statement. It's really important here that you use data to support this statement of need or the statement of the issue. And so, again, you may say, well, what data? If you have program data, program evaluation data, or just data that your program collects, certainly using that. There are also substance use data for your community, local detention data or arrest data, US Census data for talking about the characteristics of your jurisdiction. And then also, if you're not familiar with the Annie E. Casey Foundation Kids Count data, that has a whole host of information available at both the state level and some data at the county level, focusing on youth. And so those sources of information can be helpful to you crafting this description of the issue. In addition here, also what might be helpful is the citing or grounding what it is that you're doing, the issue that you're trying to solve, within the body of literature as it relates to both youth and juvenile drug treatment courts. And so on the ntcrc.org website, we have some literature that might be helpful to that. Also, Google Scholar is a great resource. If you have a research partner or evaluator, we would encourage that you reach out to that individual or individuals about what literature is out there that might support this effort that we're thinking about. And then if you haven't already, setting up Google alerts for new publications on a particular topic that you're interested in, or if you say, I just want to know what new research is available about juvenile drug treatment courts. It will actually send you an alert, and then you can kind of look through to see if any of that is helpful. But those are some sources of literature information that might be helpful for this particular section. So again, think of this as you want to really catch the attention of the reader, of the funder, to this is the issue that we're having, and now we're going to tell you about how we're going to address that, but really catching their attention here. So some tips on crafting this description of the issue. We'll talk about that in just a second, but this is an example, or this is actually verbatim from the solicitation about what you will need to address in the description of the issue. So this is what, again, cut and paste from the solicitation. Describe why this project or these proposed activities are necessary or address a need. So you need to answer that. You also need to include supporting information, such as data to provide evidence that the need exists, demonstrate the size and scope of the problem, document the effects of the problem on how the target population and the larger community, as well as how youth and family partnerships will help to address the need. So in that section A, that is what you need to respond to. So again, thinking of it in those different ways. And again, reminding you that this section is worth 10% of the score. So some tips for this section. Again, justifying that problem or need with data. Again, if you have local program data, that's excellent. Or if you have some jurisdiction level data, state level data, again, what do you have? And then citing that particular source. The source of the information is really helpful. The kids count data can be really helpful as well through the Annie E. Casey Foundation. So just being clear about where the data are and giving a reference so that if someone's interested in learning more about that, they can go to that. And then finally, making sure that the data you're citing connects to the issue or the need that you've just talked about. So making sure that people can see, again, the reviewer, the connection between the data that you're citing and the issue or the problem that you've described. So I am going to turn this over to my colleague, Christy, to move on to the project design and implementation.
Thanks, Thanks, Kristen. Hi, everybody. Again, my name is Christy or Christina Lanier. I'm the other co-director of the National Treatment Court Resource Center. I'm really glad that you're here talking with us about grant writing. We love grant writing. We're dorks that way, but we really like to talk about grant writing and help you to write the best proposal possible. Kristen mentioned some of those questions that we asked you during registration, and we noticed that the vast majority of you, when we asked if you had ever written a grant, said no. So welcome. If you're a beginner or new to the grant writing world, it can be very overwhelming. We know that, and so that's what we're here for. You can always reach out to us. We'll give you our contact information at the NTCRC at the conclusion of this, and we'll be happy to assist you in any way that we can. So I'm talking about Part B, which is the project design and implementation. As Kristen mentioned in your statement of the issue, we were talking about, or description of the issue, you're setting the stage for the need. What's going on in your community with your drug treatment court, if you already have one? Is there a need for juvenile intervention, such as a drug treatment court in your community? So at this point, you've done a really good job of setting up your issue or your need. You've included data, you've included literature, and the reviewer is saying, okay, this is great. I'm going to keep reading. Okay, how are they going to do this thing? How are they going to tackle this issue in their community? And so that's really what the project design and implementation is about. Now, recall, as Kristen said, this is 45% of the solicitation. This is a heavy weighted section of the solicitation. So you want to spend a lot of time on this section. This is the how-to. How are we going to do it? So as we talk about each of these sections, just keep in mind, we're giving you just an overview and also sharing some of our practical experiences. I know it's cliche, but really learning from our mistakes. We've been writing grants for a long time, and believe it or not, we don't get them all. Yes, I know, shocking, but we definitely want you to learn from the mistakes that we've made as we've written grants over the years, and hopefully help you not to make those same ones. So one of the things that you'll find in any solicitation, regardless of the funder, are goals, mission, objectives of the funder, and then also of the solicitation. So one of the things that we always suggest is we want to make sure that what we're talking about and how we're talking about it links to the goals of the funding agency and the solicitation. And I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. There's going to be a lot of words on the screen. It's just for an example purposes. So don't worry if you can't read it all. I'll just point out a few things. So we know that the JDTC guidelines are important. We know that RI's best practice standards are important. But we also want to talk about what are the missions and the goals for this funding stream. So when we're talking about program design and implementation, again, lots of words. But so here we have OJJDP's mission and solicitation goals. And this is directly from the solicitation, that we're talking about today. So this is the overarching view. We want to make sure that youth, that work with youth to highlight, and we bolded some of these things, that work with youth to highlight how the proposed program aligns with these priorities. So these are the priorities: treat children as children, serve children at home, et cetera, et cetera. You may already be familiar with these, but these are the goals. Now, it doesn't say you're not necessarily going to write, we are connected to the mission like this. We're going to just make sure that those are, we call it sprinkled throughout. You want to just make sure that you're presenting this information in line with OJJDP's mission. The last sentence here that we have bolded: positive outcomes for youth, families, and communities through engagement and active partnerships. And so again, that collaborative developing solution. So you might think about, when you're talking about a juvenile drug treatment court, you might think, okay, active partnerships, right? So how are we going to involve the parents in the JDTC or the guardian? How are we going to involve community partners? How are we going to involve the education system? So you're probably doing those things already if you have a court. But if you're just starting one, think about how you can pull those things into your proposal. So this is specific to this JDTC solicitation goals and objectives. I know it can be a little confusing, but nevertheless, this is what they're looking for. Again, individual level partnerships, agency level partnerships, system level partnerships. And again, we're not going to read this word for word, but when you're reading that solicitation the second or third time, really get in there and dig in and see, okay, what are they looking for in the overarching goals and objectives? What are they looking for from applicants in this solicitation? Okay. There's also two categories, as Kristen mentioned a few times. We have planning and implementation, and then the enhancement category. You'll see here that within these two categories, there's separate objectives and deliverables associated with those. So you want to become very familiar with those objectives and deliverables because you want to demonstrate how you are going to do those things. So for example, a plan to hire a JDTC coordinator to manage the coordination of activities and the strategic plan. Right, makes sense. You need a coordinator if you're implementing a program. But you want to explicitly talk about how that's going to happen, which will be in a little bit in your implementation, and then obviously in your capabilities and competencies when you're talking about your staff and who you're going to hire. So making sure that you have these highlighted, written down, and clearly laid out for you, your team, whoever's involved in making some of these decisions about what the program is going to look like. Similarly, we have objectives and deliverables for enhancement programs. So you're going to enhance or expand an existing JDTC and be responsive to, as we said before, the evidence-based juvenile treatment court guidelines. Again, objectives, making sure that we're hitting each of those, and then our deliverables, long-term strategy, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So when we're talking about program design and implementation, these are really, these goals, objectives, and missions should be in the back of our head the whole time as we're trying to develop that proposal, because it really shows the reviewer that you've taken the time to, you're not just applying for money because it's there, you're applying for these funds because you have a link to these goals, objectives, and the mission of the funding agency. You want to ensure that the proposed activities are realistic, logical, and feasible. And sometimes when I talk about this, I say, okay, duh, right? We want to make sure that things are feasible. But it does get complicated if we don't make that very clear to the reviewers. Let me give you an example. If you are going to, if you propose to serve 1,000 juveniles in your drug treatment court, but you're only asking for one case manager or one case coordinator, probably not reasonable or feasible, right? And again, that's a very broad example, kind of a silly example, but I think you understand what I'm saying. So you want to make sure that what you're saying you're going to do as part of your drug treatment court, you're going to actually be able to do it, because they're going to hold you to it. Keep that in mind. If you do get funding, they're going to hold you to whatever you said that you're going to do in that project. You want to make sure that those activities are always tying back to that issue. You want to make sure that the statement of the issue is not being forgotten as you're talking about what you're going to do. Now, clearly describe what you're proposing to do. Again, you're probably saying, well, of course, learn from our mistakes. We have had solicitations and you get reviewer feedback and it's come back and said, we're just not clear what X, Y, and Z is intended to do. Or it's not clear how A is going to get to B. So 30 pages double-spaced may seem like a lot. Once you start writing, you'll realize it's not. But that's why, as Kristen said, you just start writing so that you're making sure you're putting all of that information into that document. And then you can go back and cut things and use some little tricks like ampersands and these types of things that can help you to keep it shorter than 30 pages. I want to show you an example of the project design and implementation section from this actual solicitation that's out right now. Again, a lot of words on the screen, but just want to show you a couple of things and point out some tips and tricks that we use when we're writing that outline. So here you see, this is again that 45%. And we've bolded some of these very specific things. So again, how are you going to address the problem in that description of the issue? That follows you throughout, okay? How is it related to goals, objectives, deliverables? Detailed description of the methods to be used to carry out each activity. So in this particular solicitation, there's only a couple of what we would call bullet points. So this bullet point and this bullet point. Because it's all in one paragraph, let's say. What we would do in this situation is each of those sentences, we would kind of make them their own bullet point, right? Again, just practical advice, make them their own bullet point. Then we would go through and just answer each of those bullet points that we've kind of created from this paragraph. And then obviously we would take the bullet points out. But what that does is it helps you to answer, as you will hear us say 45 times, answer the bullet points in the order that they appear. Now, again, lesson learned. Kristen and I are academics. We write for a living. So we would write a grant and think, oh, well, you know, bullet 1 and bullet 5, that's kind of saying the same thing. So we'll just combine those. No, don't do that. Bullet 1 answers, bullet 5 gets an answer. We actually talked to a reviewer, a real reviewer, and they completely agreed with us. They said, oh, when people do that, it is so much easier because we don't have to go digging for the information. That is key for reviewers. They don't want to go digging for the information. Okay. So making sure that you answer each of those sentences in the order or bullet points, however it's laid out, that they are received. Now down here at the bottom, you'll see some italics. That's about priority areas. We didn't really talk about those yet. So priority areas are basically elements of the program that are, quote unquote, give a little bit more, some more points, I guess you would say, to the application. It doesn't mean that you're automatically going to get it, but it helps because these are the areas, in this case, that OJP is interested in programs pursuing. And so the two priorities right now are around equity and inclusion and underserved populations. So we just included that. If you have more questions about priority areas, we're happy to answer those as well. So a couple of tips. I know we already said it, but answer the bullet and headings in the order that they appear. It's extremely important that you do that. One other thing that you might want to do, and actually in the adult treatment court solicitation, you have to do it, is make sure that when you're talking about, in this case, the JDTC guidelines, and again, this is just a practical piece of advice, is to bold in the document where you're talking about those. So we'll put in parentheses, in this case, we might say JDTC guideline number 3. So that when the reviewer is saying, especially when we're talking about implementation grants, the reviewer, because you have to address all 7, is looking to see, did you address all 7? They can see those very quickly within the document and know that, okay, you followed directions. I mean, part of this is literally following directions. That really is the first step in grant writing. We want to make sure that when we're talking about those evidence-based practices, those activities, that we justify the use of those with research and literature. We get a lot of questions about this. So if you're using a particular evidence-based practice, you want to make sure that it's appropriate for your target population. I know with juvenile drug treatment courts, that can sometimes be a challenge because so much is targeted at adults in adult treatment courts. So we want to really work hard to find those evidence-based practices targeted at juveniles and make sure that they're for our target population as well. Okay. So we've gone through, we've presented our issue. We've made it very clear to the reviewer that this is an important area that needs to be addressed. We've talked about how we're going to address it. And now we're going to talk about the skills and expertise related to the project or the program, often called capabilities and competencies. And so in this section, what you're really looking to do is to demonstrate that your agency has the capacity to run this program. So how you're going to do that is talking about your team members, talking about the credentials of your team members. And there's specific, again, bullet points that you need to include in this section, which I'll show you an example in a moment. But generally speaking, we're talking about your treatment partnership, the history with your treatment provider. Now, if you're implementing a new program and you're saying, well, we're new, we don't have a treatment provider history yet, that's okay. You want to talk about the treatment provider's history, their credentials, how they've been involved in the community, who they serve, et cetera, and making sure that they have served the target population that you're interested in serving with your program. You want to talk about the training of team members. So this is kind of a place where you're going to toot the horn of your team members and yourself to make sure that they understand you've worked with this population, your team members have worked with this population, everybody's on board to start or enhance the juvenile drug treatment court. Okay. Within capabilities and competencies, you want to make sure to talk about the roles and responsibilities of all key personnel. This is really important. Again, lesson learned. If you talk about somebody in your budget, a person under personnel, they need to be discussed in your project narrative. Very important. And again, we talked with that reviewer about this specifically, and she said absolutely, because they look at the budget and they look at who is going to be doing what in your capabilities and competencies. And if there's a mismatch there, that can be a problem. Because remember, the budget is 10%. So if they're seeing a mismatch, or they're like, wait, these three people are being paid by this grant, but there's absolutely no discussion of what they're going to do as part of this grant in the capabilities and competencies, that's going to send a red flag. They might say, oh, well, they're just trying to pay these people from this grant. They're not actually working on this grant. So you want to make sure that all key personnel are discussed in the capabilities and competencies. If they're in your budget, you need to talk about it. And related to budget, anything that's in your budget, you need to talk about it in your project design implementation. So if you're going to do drug screening and you're going to pay for drug screening equipment through your budget, you better talk about drug screening in your project design and implementation. Kind of a tangent, but talking about budget, making sure that those things line up. Okay. If you have to have an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, and for many grants you do, you really have to start these early in the process. You're trying to get multiple partners to sign onto one document. Usually in these MOUs, each partner, there's a description of their responsibility as it relates to the treatment court. And you want to make sure that everybody knows what their job is and what their role is, especially when you're talking about multiple partner agencies. Is there a partner agency that needs to help collect data? If there is, that needs to be clear in the MOU and make sure that that's a known responsibility for that particular entity. Okay. You often attach job descriptions and/or resumes. And remember, you made that to-do list, so you know what attachments you need. Attachments are, there's so many attachments in some grant proposals that you have to have. I'm telling you, the to-do list will be your saving grace. If somebody is already in the job or in the position, we usually attach resumes. If somebody's to be hired, job descriptions are needed. Really pay attention to what is required of that solicitation, because you want to make sure that you're not missing anything when you hit submit in that Just Grants portal. You want to make sure that you've got everything uploaded as is needed. So let me show you, as I said, I'll show you an example like we have with the other sections. And this is what it looks like in the current solicitation. So you'll see here, describe the capabilities, what the applicant brings to the project, resources, experience, and competencies. One of the things that's important in this section as well is making clear that your agency or whomever has the fiscal responsibility, so you can actually manage the grant. So we've had, if the county's applying, let's say, you talk about the county and their fiscal responsibility, how they're a great fiscal agent and they've never had issues, et cetera, okay? Really important to talk about those things. And as I said, your history, talking about competencies of supporting youth and family partnerships, very important. You'll notice that in almost every section, that phrase, supporting youth and family partnerships, right, is there. So make sure that you really focus and pay attention to that. Again, this is another priority area. If you, in fact, were applying for a priority area 1B, you can read about this. This is actually tied directly to budget, 40% of your budget. You can, again, read about that. You would talk about it here. That's basically what it's saying. So in the previous section, you would talk about priority 1A. If you were applying under that, here you would talk about priority 1B, should you be applying as a priority 1B applicant. So that's just telling you where to put that information. In this particular case, it's in the capabilities and competencies. Answer the bullet points in the order they are presented. Yes, please do. I know we've said it, but again, you want to break, because of the way that this solicitation is set up, there's not necessarily a bunch of bullet points. I would break out those sentences into your own bullet points and then answer those in the order that they appear. I mentioned this already, but really I have to stress it. You have to pay attention to needed attachments. There's usually a checklist at the end of all applications. It has all the things that you need to do that are related to that application or that solicitation. And so I would make sure that you go through that and make sure that you have all of those things checked off to make sure that they're in. Okay. So the last section of the project narrative. So again, this is part of your 30 pages. So you've talked about the issue. So what are we going to address? We've talked about how we're going to address it with our project design and implementation. We've said that we have the capacity, the capability, and the competency to address the issue through those activities that we've just talked about. Now, the last section is saying, okay, how are we going to know that you have accomplished the goals that you have set out to do? So all solicitations have some sort of performance measures that you have to collect. In this particular world, it's usually called a PMT, performance measurement tool. And you have to be sure that you can collect the data required for that solicitation. Now, it's very important, and they say this in the solicitation, that when you're writing this section, you don't actually have to go look at the performance measures and submit data for the application. You just have to demonstrate that you have the capacity to collect that data. So here are some questions that we often ask when we're trying to write this section. You want to describe the process and the plan. So think about these questions. Who's responsible for collecting this data? Where is it going to be stored and maintained? So when we get into things like password protected, HIPAA, et cetera, we want to make sure that we have that outlined in our plan for collecting the data. I won't read through all of these, but think about how often will it be shared with your stakeholders? How often will it be reviewed? You want to be very clear in this section as to who is collecting the data, where it's being stored, and how it's being collected. Again, another lesson learned. We had a program where a number of, well, 3 to 4, I suppose, which seems like a number of agencies were kind of contributing to the data collection process. One of our critiques, that particular application didn't get funded. One of our critiques was we don't know the role, in this particular case, it was probation. We don't know the role that probation is playing in the data collection process. So Kristen and I failed to clearly articulate how the data collection process involved probation. Again, learn from our mistakes, make sure it's clear, make sure everybody involved, it's clear what they're doing, okay? Relatedly, there is a timeline associated in just grants that was just talked about. And in the past, if you wrote grants in the past, the timeline was an attachment that we attached. Now it's actually done within the Just Grants portal. I highly suggest that there's some resources available specifically around the timeline. I highly suggest that you go look at that. There's some screenshots that you can see how it works. Within there, I'll just say that you have a specific goal, and then you write an objective related, and then deliverables related to that objective, and then you identify what fiscal year and what quarter that specific deliverable will be obtained. So that's important. But if you've talked about, at least in your brain, what are we collecting, and we've looked at the performance measures, then that shouldn't be too difficult because we've laid that out. Now, one other just thing I want to mention is now there are performance measures. There's required performance measures. as a program, you're probably going to want to collect more than just what's in that performance measurement tool. So think about what other things that you might need to ensure that your program is operating as intended and that you're getting the outcomes that you're hoping to get from the program for your participants. So really thinking about outcomes from your logic model, what does that look like? How do we know if we've decreased truancy? Okay, well, we need to figure out how we're going to know that. And what data are we going to collect? And from whom are we going to get that data? So those details are really important when you're talking about your plan for collecting the data. So one more example. As I said a moment ago, you don't have to actually collect the data. You have to describe the process for measuring project performance, how you're going to utilize youth and family voices in deciding which data will be collected. Again, all these questions I just said, who's going to collect it, who's responsible for performance measures, et cetera, et cetera. Describe the process to accurately report data. So as I said a few minutes ago, you're going to go beyond just the performance measures. And this is really indicating that. So what data is going to be collected and having youth and family voices, because remember, youth and family partnerships, we've heard that throughout the whole thing, as part of that data collection process. Okay. Couple of tips. I know you're surprised. Answer the bullets in the order that they are presented. See, this is a webinar. I can't see your faces. I just assume you're all laughing at us. Specify the data collection plan and the process. The more specific you can be, the better. Ensure that the data you need is available before funding is received. So you have to be able to collect those performance measures, bare minimum. You need to go look at those. There's a link to them in the solicitation. You have to be able to collect those. If you can't, if you're like right at this moment, we can't collect that, then you need to figure out a way to be able to collect it. And then be clear about how you're going to do that, how you're going to collect that information. Okay. So that, in a nutshell, is the project narrative. We've gone A, B, C, D, and now our reviewer has looked at all of that information and they've said, yeah, you're funded. So one of the things that we do is we kind of work backwards. You've heard us reference the abstract. Kristen referenced that earlier. And if you've ever read a journal article or any sort of publication, you know what an abstract is. It's a summary of whatever you're getting ready to read, basically. And so in all of these solicitations, you have to have an abstract. You have to provide an abstract. Now, for us, the abstract is typically written last. And that's because all the information that we just put in that 30-page program narrative is going to inform the abstract. There's always a word limit. There's usually specific information that needs to go in there. So for example, very specific information in the adult treatment court solicitation, it is the best practice standards and what pages you talk about them on. So that's really specific. And then we really want to be able to look and read your abstract and know exactly what your program does. So kind of like the logic model, when we talked about it being a bird's eye view, this is really an overview of the project put into words, okay? Now, we have heard from some entities or some people that there are reviewers that will read the abstract and decide whether or not to read on. Because again, if you can follow directions and put the word limit, what they ask you for, then you've demonstrated that you can at least follow directions and perhaps they can move on. Here's what the proposal abstract looks like for this particular solicitation. You can see no more than 400 words. This is very broad in what needs to be included. So you kind of have to work through this as far as, okay, purpose, primary activities, and getting that into 400 words. Similar to the project narrative, Kristen and I kind of write the abstract, make sure all that stuff's in there, and then we go back and cut. This is really, as it says here, this is the publicly available website if it's awarded. So this is where you can go and see those projects that have been funded. What you see there is their abstract, okay? So be sure to address each bullet point if there are bullet points. Ensure that the information is the same as the information in the project narrative. So if the total budget was requested, make sure it matches whatever's in your actual budget. The number of participants served is the same. And that seems like common sense, but it could be that you started writing, because remember, you're writing this last. You started writing and you went and changed the number of participants served for some reason, but then you forgot to change it in the abstract if that's a requirement. So I'm just making sure that everything is consistent. If you have to provide the page numbers where they discuss the best practices, and then this again is a web form in Just Grants, so different from before. It used to be a PDF you would upload. We just suggest type it in Word and then cut and paste it into the web form in Just Grants, because you want to make sure that you don't lose that, that abstract that you've worked so hard on. Okay. All right. So just a few summary, bring us around. Yes, there are places where there is repetition. You will see that. And you will, again, that little moment will come where you think, oh, well, I can just say see above. Please don't say see above. Answer it again. Okay. I promise you, you're just going to answer it again. Really, again, I know we stressed this at the beginning, but really starting early, that solicitation is out there right now. Get on it, download that solicitation, print it off, start reading it, underlining, highlighting all those important things, because putting all the materials together is very, very, I mean, it's really important. Answer all the bullet points or all of the sentences, depending on what it looks like in that solicitation. Really, data and research to support the need for funding and the evidence-based practices. Those are really important, and I'm sure you all know that evidence-based practices are really important. So you want to make sure that you're very clear as to why you're using those evidence-based practices, why you're using it for that target population, et cetera, et cetera. I mentioned this application checklist at the end of the solicitation. Some of the things that we just point out, the priority areas that we talked about, there's a research and evaluation independence statement, disclosures, assurances, all these documents that have to be done. And that sounds overwhelming, but I promise you, if you just use that checklist and use your to-do list, you will be good. Start early getting letters of support. If you're applying for this upcoming solicitation, you need to start getting your letters of support and in the MOUs or MOAs right now. When we're done with this webinar, you need to start figuring out who you need to contact for those things. And I know it seems, again, cliche, but really just staying organized. As I mentioned, I know a lot of you are new to the grant writing world. It can be overwhelming. We're happy to assist you in any way that we can. We have a lot of data on our website if you're looking for data. Really important to have that data and cite those sources. So thank you very much. This is our contact information for Kristen and I. And you'll get this slideshow as a PDF. And so what we've included in here also are some resources that are available. There is a solicitation webinar on April 19th from 1 to 3. You can sign up for that. We actually have that link on our website under our grant resources page if you are interested. And again, when we send these out, all of these links will be live and you can just click on them and get what you need. This is our maps where we have a juvenile drug treatment court map, by the way. I would definitely go check that out. And then the Annie Casey Foundation Kids Count data. Oh, and then our MTCRC grant writing resources. We have a lot of those up on the website. And I'm going to turn it over to Travis.
Thank you so much, Christina. Guys, real quick, I just want to provide you guys with some resources that we currently have here at All Rise. On the juvenile side, one of those resources is our training and technical assistance app. Okay, so we use the OJJDP's TTA 360. It gives you guys access to statewide, individual, or virtual juvenile treatment court trainings. So you guys can go on the site, go into that app, submit your request, and we'll be happy to provide you with any form of training. Also, we have a Tune In Tuesdays webinar series that we host quarterly. Okay, and this gives you guys an opportunity for members that are involved in Tune In Tuesdays to learn about practical tools to address common challenges in your JDTC program. Third, You can also join our JDTC listserv, okay? You guys can be able to connect with the Juvenile Drug Treatment Court community, share ideas, and access support from experts in the field. I find a lot of people find this beneficial when they are in need of specific documents or if they have questions that they need answering pretty quickly. And lastly, guys, we have our JDTC National Dashboard. This dashboard was created in 2022. It features an interactive map that provides information about the tools, programs, and resources utilized by the juvenile drug treatment courts across the country. So these resources was developed to not only further interactions among practitioners, but to also build upon the best practices for juvenile drug treatment courts. Next slide, please. Here's our contact information. If you guys have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out to us, guys. That is what we're here for. This is what we're paid to do. So my address is here on the screen. Also, my partner in crime, Paul Bowen, he's another project director for All Rise. Do not hesitate to reach out to him as well. All right, Kristen, I guess we'll go into the question and answering series.
Yes, so we would encourage you, if you haven't already and you have a question, please put that in the Q&A. Question for you, Travis. What is the next day of the quarterly training for the webinar series, I believe?
Okay, so the exact date is going to be on the website. That is handled with our partners, NCJ, FCJ. So I'm not entirely sure the exact date, but I can get that information to you.
Okay, great. Erica, this might be a question for you. Can you access grants.gov through ERA Commons/login.gov?
You know, that I am not sure about. I was actually researching that. Give me a few minutes and let me look. I'm still looking for information on that. I'm not sure if you can access it from there due to the requirements for the email and login, because they are some of that information is transferred to Just Grants. So I'm still looking that up. Give me a few seconds and I'll see if I can grab an answer for you.
Okay.
All right. So Kristen, just to let you know, so grants.gov, you can access, when you go to grants.gov, there is an option for you to sign in via login.gov. You can also, it also has a an option for you to sign in for federal users using your PIV and AMS for HHS grantors. So when you go to hit login, it gives you a few different options.
Perfect. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
You want to read the rest of them, Kristen?
Sure. If we did not spend all of the money from the last JDTC grant, would we be able to apply for this one?
I think that may be a question for Charles, if he's still on the call. So Charles,
Still here.
yeah,
I'm still here. So, yes, as long as your risk factor hasn't changed and how you closed out or how you manage your federal funding, it's certain variables that go into that. But as long as you are within good standing, then you'll be able to apply for federal funding. It's not really it's not solely dependent on if you have remaining funds over and you weren't able to draw down or expend all your federal funding. It is really a case by case, but it really contingent on how you manage your funding, your risk status, and the variables that went into that.
Great, thank you. And another question, would an entity be turned down due to funding being too high? And then a subsequent portion of the question is, would they be overlooked? Is it better to ask for less?
That's another question for Charles.
One time if my audio went out.
Yeah. Would an entity be turned down due to funding being too high? And would they be overlooked? Is it better to ask for less?
It's better to ask for what is appropriate. You know, what do you think you can actually manage, right? Asking for less is not a determining factor if you'll be decided if you'll be picked or not, right? It's a lot of things that go into that. So that is not a determining factor in regards to being selected for an award, if how much you're asking for. The awards, you know, typically we have so many awards that we're able to actually hand out, and they're scored, and the amount is not a factor when determining the scoring.
Okay. And here's another kind of grant question. Can we have grants overlap? For example, our current OJJDP grant ends September of 2025, so the next fiscal year, but there's an opportunity for an expansion grant that would start this year, October 1st of 2024.
So you can have grants overlap, but you cannot commingle funds, right? So the money that you actually receive for a particular award, that could not be used for anything other than what it's supposed to be used for. So we have grantees that have several awards at the same time, but there's no commingling funds or no supplanting of any kind. That's clearly outlined in financial management training and the parameters of the award. So to answer the question, the answer is yes, but they have to be used. They have to be used exactly on the award and not commingling the funds.
If you do not use all of the funding during the timeline, is it a matter of use it or lose it? Or are you able to roll it over?
So that question would more or less lead to a program period extension. So just because during the particular timeline, and what we do understand is, you know, how you start and how you finish may be distinctly different, right? Because things change as far as staffing, the ability to when to start a program. So if after the terms of the agreement of the grant, the lifespan of the grant, if there was additional time needed, the grantee would be eligible to apply for a project period extension to, as long as they have a timeline and a strong justification of why they need additional time for to spend down federal funds.
Great, thank you. Is grant training available later on? I'm not sure what type of grant training.
Oh, my question would be, and I hate to answer a question with a question because it's so broad, right? So what I'll say is there are mandates in training that you have to do even when you accept the award within the first 100 and I think 20 to 180 days for you to be able to draw down funds. And that training is provided by the agency. Financial management training is an award condition for all grantees, and that training is provided by the agency.
Yeah, she's saying the mandated training, so you're exactly right. It's mandated. That's what she was referencing.
Then yes, it is provided. But you do have a time frame when to get that done. And in the event that you do not if you do not do the training, you will be in suspended status because you won't be able to draw down funds at all. It's a part of your award conditions.
This one says, during COVID, our population changed. Concern is if our numbers would decrease dramatically, would that place our grant at risk?
Can you repeat that? My audio went out again. I'm sorry.
During COVID, our population changed. Concern is if our numbers would decrease dramatically, would that place our grant at risk?
Oh, no, it wouldn't. The agency, and this is what I was alluding to earlier, this is a good example of that, right? How you start and how you finish. The agency do understands that things come up, things happen, especially in the times that we are in now, and give some flexibility in I would say like a realignment, whether it's a program scope change, whether you need to reallocate funds because you expected so many people early on, but because due to COVID or any other unforeseen circumstances, you need to move money around. So there is some flexibility and understanding, but again, that is case by case and built around the justification for whatever the circumstance is.
Great.
All
And
right.
those of you that are still on, there is a the solicitation webinar, which is I said February, like as if I want to say April 12th, was that right? But that is a really good webinar to attend, and those logistical questions, they usually have a very long Q&A at those. And so April 19th from 1 to 3, I'm sorry, I was 7 days early. But those are good to attend and really get those questions answered as far as the logistics of the solicitation as well. All right.
All right, I think that is all of the questions that we're asking the Q&A. Once again, I want to just thank everyone for joining the call, and we're looking forward to hearing from you guys in the future. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.